Hey everyone, it's Alex Velitis. For those that don't know me, I'm a product manager at LinkedIn and also the author of the best-selling book on college, Modern College. So for those of you that have followed me online for a while, you know that this is actually a different medium than how I generally, react with or interact with people on the internet. So usually I do everything written. I either write blog articles, post, even wrote a book, but I really haven't experimented much with video. And I wanted to try that today. And this is going to be very raw. And this is, obviously a new experience for me. But the reason I wanted to try that is I know that so much of the internet and our world is shifting to video first media. So I realized that if I really want to scale my advice and my reach, I need to start getting better at using this medium. So that's why I wanted to use this medium. In terms of the topic I want to talk about today, I want to talk about the advice that I would give colleges for basically how they should approach the fall 2020 semester. So, the reason I'm talking about this topic in particular is, number one, I wrote this book on modern college. So I obviously have a lot of thoughts and opinions and think about this space a lot. So it makes sense that, I take a chance to try to take that knowledge and that research and apply it to what's happening today. And the second is that it's very timely. So we're towards the end of July now of 2020. And in the next month or so, the academic school year for universities is going to begin. And what I've noticed in, just the past few months as we've approached that start is that there's a lot of uncertainty around what to do and how universities should react. In a lot of ways, these universities are in an impossible position. And I do hope that everyone keeps that in mind when they are actually looking at the decisions that are being made or the way we talk about it. I think it's important that we have empathy. It's easy, I think, to lob criticism at people when you don't have any skin in the game or when it doesn't affect you directly. But when you are actually the people that are in, the arena making these decisions, and all you have are decisions in front of you that have downsides, that's a very tough spot to be in. It's one I don't envy. I just want to, encourage us all to have a little bit empathy for the people that do have to make these decisions come fall. So that's kind of my, preamble. And on that note, I kind of want to start to dive into the content of an article I wrote on this. So obviously I'm going to speak through it, but I'm going to follow the template of this new article that I just created. So to help make this, video a little bit more engaging, I'm going to share my screen without to share you different information. So this is the article I'm going to be releasing. It's called How Universities Should Approach the Fall 2020 Semester. And I'll start off with the very first thing I tackle up front with this article, which is there's kind of this initial question you have to answer that affects the way you approach all device. And that question is basically like, should universities be open at all in fall, right? And I actually want to take that even one click deeper and say that there's like two sub questions off of that. So if your answer is just like blanket no, like students should be on campus, we shouldn't do classrooms, that's like one way to segment off one bucket. Then I think there's also like in the yes bucket, this like branched out decision tree. So one option would be yes, like we can open up the campuses, but we don't do classes. Or yes, we'll be open, but it'll be some sort of hybrid model when it comes to the campus experience. So I wanted to start off by addressing that question from my point of view, because I think it's key to all the advice I'm going to give for universities coming after that. So basically how I approach this fundamental question is I try to look at the data, right? And the couple of things that I was keeping in mind when I looked at the data is you always have to have like a goal or a true north in mind. And I think this is something that we have really struggled with in the United States, is basically defining like what is our true north. So how I perceived it and what was, I think, initially described as the true north for coronavirus was that we basically wanted to keep cases down to a point that we wouldn't overrun our hospital systems. This is where the concept of flattening the curve came from, right? So if we look at that, based on the data I'm seeing from Google, I think there's like some debate of whether we have flattened that or not. And let me explain. So obviously, if you look at it here, beginning of April is when we truly started to get a lot more cases, right? And we seem to actually have like almost a stability. This is what I think from a visual standpoint would look like flattening the curve. And then we have this big bump up. So my initial reaction when I looked at this data was that, this looks like we haven't flattened the curve. But I also took it one step deeper then, and I filtered on deaths. And what I do find interesting is that if you look at it from a deaths perspective, we very much have flattened the curve. Like if you look at the apex of, basically every week, it does seem to have flattened a bit, right? So I think the question here is, why are the cases so much higher, right? And I think it's one of two things. It's either one, based on the death rate, more people ended up getting it than before, and essentially it's maybe lost its potency, or we found a way to treat it better, so the death rate has gone down. Another option is that basically right now we're testing much more than we did in the beginning. And I think the answer is probably somewhere a little bit in between. So I think most people would agree we are significantly testing much more now in July than we even were in June, and definitely way more than we were doing in April or May. So I think the testing is certainly a part of it. I also think there's been obviously an improvement in the way that we treat it. So we've learned things like, it helps if you bring someone in to try to turn them on their stomach. We've come up with different therapeutic remedies. So there's definitely been some improvements on that front as well. And the reason I wanted to get back to this, right, is because I think it comes back to this fundamental question. So if the goal is to flatten the curve, right, and we have flattened that curve, then theoretically, right, we have some kind of room, some wiggle room to try to open up, society a little bit more in this fall semester. So obviously, if the statements I just made were incorrect, right, and we actually haven't flattened the curve, I think this is a really key point. We haven't flattened the curve, then I think it's much more difficult to want to take much risk at all. In fact, we might want to correct the other way. But based on what I'm looking at here in the different reports I've read in the death rate, I do actually think we've got into a relatively stable point here. And that gets back to this question of like, what is our true north? Is our true north to flatten the curve, or is it to fundamentally stop the spread of this virus? And I think those are very different North Stars, and you would react to them differently. So if our goal was to stop the spread, then in all honesty, we should lock everything down again. However, I think for a lot of economic reasons, for a lot of societal reasons, mental health reasons, et cetera, it doesn't really make sense to lock down, especially when it's still going to be a significant amount of time before we have a widely distributed vaccine. So I'm operating from the assumption that we want to flatten the curve. So assuming that's the case, the next question is, if we allow students to go back onto campus, will that lead to massive spikes in positive cases and to a point where it actually overwhelms our healthcare systems, and we actually see this flattened death rate skyrocket again? So this is, I think, the question. And from what I can see, the natural thing I went to is, this is from the American Council on Science and Health. And I was really struggling to find, like a death rate by age and stuff. I actually really couldn't find one. I'm sure if I'd spent a little bit more time, I might have been able to find one. But suffice it to say, I've seen the death rate among basically this college demo of like 18 to 22-year-olds as being fairly low. And when you look at it from the percentage of COVID deaths, what we're looking at here is basically about 0.1%, right? Maybe even lower, because this includes like a few years, like 23 and 24-year-olds generally are not in college. So given that, we see people in the college age demographic tending to not, have as severe reactions, they tend to not end up in the ICU, they tend to not, see a lot of deaths among this age group. I actually think that, putting them back on campus is not going to be a significant risk to this age group directly. Okay, but it's not that simple, right? We need to look at the second order effects. So one thing that I've heard a lot of people bring up is they've essentially said, okay, a lot of these colleges or campuses exist on these sort of college towns. So the areas that basically will like inflate and deflate in terms of population when school's in session versus not. And the fundamental concern there is that you allow students to come back to the campus, they aggregate, they become super spreaders, while they might not necessarily end up overwhelming the hospitals because they're in these college towns, because they're going to these businesses and these restaurants, and a lot of them are testing positive. They're going to infect a lot of people in those towns that are in more susceptible ages, right? Like maybe this like 55 and up age bracket. And that will in turn lead to an overwhelming of the hospitals. So on this front, I think there are a lot of valid concerns here. However, when I reflected on this a little bit more, I don't quite buy the idea of just keeping college students at home. And I'll tell you why. So the alternative, if you don't allow students to come back to campus, is that they're going to basically stay in their parents' houses, right? And a lot of these parents basically are within these age groups that are more susceptible. So we're talking the 45 to 54, 55 to 64. I know my parents are personally, in the 55 to 64 age bracket, and I still have a brother in school. So this is like, if you look at it, this is a pretty significant jump. And the problem is, we don't want to, in my opinion, if you allow college students to just go back into your parents' houses, you're basically putting millions of infection vectors back inside the houses of some of the more vulnerable people. And I think there's another thing to keep in mind here, right? Which is that there's this, I think, underlying belief that if you send college students back to their hometowns, they're not going to aggregate. And I can tell you from firsthand knowledge, I've been in a couple different cities during COVID, like young people are still going to aggregate to a degree. They might not be going crazy, but they're not going to be perfect. And I think if you put them back in their parents' house, the same students that would have congregated and become super spreaders on their college campus are going to do the same thing in their hometowns. And the ones that were going to be responsible in college are going to be responsible at home too. I think we give a little bit too much weight to this idea that like parents are going to somehow control their children. And I can tell you, being someone who's 26 now and recently went through that transition from high school to college, like there is a big mental shift and you very much are responsible for yourself, right? And I think this speaks to the last point, which is that I think by not allowing college students to go back to campus, we're essentially, I think, talking down to their abilities to mature and actually follow rules and understand the situation. Like a big part of college is realizing that you are now becoming an adult, and with being an adult comes understanding these bigger responsibilities, such as if you don't follow rules, people might die, right? And that's literally the case with COVID. And so in my opinion, like we are not actually putting the responsibility and the power in the hands of these young people to actually have a great learning and maturation experience. Like they need to learn what it's like to make these decisions. It shouldn't be up to mommy and daddy to tell you that, hey, you shouldn't go in a packed bar or you shouldn't go in a packed house party. You are old enough and your brain is developed enough at that point that you should be able to process those things yourself. Like if you can't process that we're in a pandemic right now, I just highly doubt that like you being in your parents' house for a couple more months is going to suddenly change that. So anyways, that is my long-winded explanation to basically get back to this initial point is, should colleges open? And my answer is yes, with a lot of caveats. So if we go into that yes side, I'm now clearly over there. I'm not in the no to complete shutdown. I'm on the yes side. And I believe that the campuses themselves should be open to some degree. So I can say that much with, strong confidence is that at least some percentage of students should be allowed to go back to the college. The reason is that we're taking them out of the homes of some of the more vulnerable age demos, right? And actually putting them on a campus where they're isolated from that. It gets a little more tricky now once we start to get into the details of it. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I know the exact details, but this is at least the general bucket I would be on. In terms of how many students you allow back, I think that's where you can bring in the experts, bring in epidemiologists, right? Bring in people that can actually look at the logistics of what the capacity is that your campus can hold, right? And so let's take classrooms out of the picture. So we're now looking at dorm rooms and apartments. I have some very tangible advice of what I would do at this point. So I think the first thing is, the colleges can control the dorms. That is actually university housing So they have complete autonomy there. And if you're going to open in fall, in my opinion, you need to ensure that at a minimum, every student has their own bedroom and at least a 30-minute gap in the morning and at night to be in the bathrooms by themselves, right? Like I think in general, like you don't want to have a bunch of students in the same bathrooms, brushing their teeth, using the toilets with a bunch of them in there. And I understand that this is probably the most contentious part because it's not easy. Like ideally you want to have some level of sanitation in between people using it. And a lot of the dorms are shared. So this idea of like being able to give people their own bathroom, I don't know if it's feasible, but I do believe there's that healthy balance of being able to give people slots, right? Having a schedule where you can sign up to go in at a specific time and having some basic cleaning supplies, where when you're done, spray down the handles, wash your hands, have sanitizer when you enter, et cetera, et cetera. The next thing I would do is that you then have to address the housing that you don't directly control on your university. So I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's a big campus. It's in a college town, and a lot of people lived in private housing that was either off campus and or not under the purview of the university. So at this point, you're a little bit constrained as a university, but I still think there's things you can do to try to make sure that your students aren't living on top of each other, or ideally not sharing a bedroom. And so one thing I think you could do is these universities have a good idea of all of the biggest property managers and building managers on their campus or around their campus. What I would recommend is sending out a letter to them and strongly encouraging them to only rent out entire rooms to students. Don't let them share rooms, don't let them pack houses. And this should be like very much a rallying cry together, because I think these properties need to recognize that, like, look, if you break these rules and you just start packing your apartment and coronavirus starts spreading like wildfire, parents are going to pull their students out. You're going to have to shut down the campuses completely, and they're going to lose all that rent money. So I have faith that a lot of these property managers would very much get behind that with the universities to recognize, yes, like we're not going to pack this house. We're going to try to follow your guidelines, because we know that the second you shut things down completely as a university, all of our business is going to go, all our students are going to go, right? And then I guess the last thing is like now talking about the classroom, right? And I think this is like one, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole here because I genuinely don't know all the right answers here. But I think there's a few things you could do with the universities, right? Or with the classroom setting itself. So I think number one, you should absolutely be prioritizing the classes or labs that benefit the most from in-person experience. So I can say personally, from having a few physics, chemistry, biology courses, those labs were a crucial part of the curriculum. And I think you can basically optimize that if you're going to have students like in these buildings, make sure they're in it to do classes that can't be replicated online, right? So that would be the first thing, is have some prioritization. I think the second is I think you can be a little innovative. And this gets into some of the stuff I talk about down here, which is basically that, obviously you're not going to be able to jam pack these lecture halls, right? And I think this is where a lot of people bring up good points, is that you don't want to just basically have a ton of students sitting shoulder to shoulder in a lecture hall with no windows, which were a lot of the lecture halls I experienced at UW-Madison. That is a recipe for disaster. And this is actually a good time to interject a piece of content. Those of you that follow me, I'm a big fan of Scott Galloway. I think he talks very eloquently and has a lot of data behind a lot of the areas he talks about. And he talks about the ones I'm interested in, which are higher ed and, tech and just business strategy in general. And one of the things he did really well in his last article is he called out basically that there is, number one, I think he points out that there's a lot of uncertainty among the universities. And two, he brings in a lot of good data, right? Specifically of like how colleges will be affected by this. He starts the article off, and I think this is where I differ from him a little bit in terms of my opinion, is he starts this article off by suggesting that, like, you can look from the, image here. He's clearly trying to send a message, which is like, the image we have in our heads as being these super spreader locations are cruise ships. Like that was the first place where like everyone was getting it. And he's basically saying that if you put college kids back on campus in open classrooms, right, essentially every university is going to have the cruise ship effect, which is that they're going to spread like crazy. They'll become super spreaders. It'll affect the college towns, and it's going to basically get out of control, and we won't flatten the curve or keep the curve flattened. And while I think directionally he's right, I do think there's a little bit of wiggle room here, right? And this is where I have this whole point around embrace innovation, is that I think you can get creative here. So I'll give you a few tangible examples. Like number one, let's mandate masks within the school buildings. Like the schools have the autonomy to do this. I don't think it should be politicized. I don't think it's, something that like should be open to debate. Like if you want to be in a college lecture hall or in any campus building, like you should be wearing a mask, right? I think that's one thing. I think the second is that you can basically, especially if you only have a portion of your students on campus, let's say only 50% come back when you open it up, or you only allow 50% to come back, then what you can essentially do is work with that set of students and basically alternate days they come in. So maybe, you break a lecture hall into 3 cohorts, right? It's 100 students. You basically say, look, we're only going to allow 30 of you to come in on Mondays and Wednesdays. 30 of you are going to come in like Tuesday, Thursdays. And then, one cohort will get to come in on Friday, and we'll extend the lecture hall time to be worth like double lecture, right? And maybe some students just have to deal with that a little bit more. Or you make the Friday one like you can sign up for it, right? And then it's whoever, wants to get that extra time can. But I think there are options here that if you're wearing a mask and you're in a big lecture hall and you basically only allow like a small set in and they're all 6 feet apart, and you maybe even have things like hand sanitizer or things when you come in, I do believe that it is worth trying, right? Now we should monitor this, right? Like if we start doing this and colleges are taking strong protocols and suddenly there's spikes, 100% shut down the lecture halls. I'm not arguing that. What I do worry about is that we don't even try. And then basically the vaccine takes a long time to come and get distributed. And this isn't like a 1 semester thing, but basically we have like 2 years where this risk is still here and we haven't even attempted to find a happy medium. So again, that's a little bit of what I talk about here in terms of embracing innovation. I think, there's things you can do here. I even have something as, a little out there of like, if you're in a warm climate, I think it's been shown that when you're outside, there's less of a chance of you, actually passing it on to other people. So you could look at universities in warmer climates, possibly extending their classroom to outdoors, setting up, tents and like chairs out on campus greens, maybe taking over parking lots. And, for a few months, maybe you just have outdoor lectures, give the professor a microphone. I don't know. Basically, the whole point I'm trying to get at is I think we need to try to innovate a little here, and we have to at least take an attempt, right? And I don't think we should judge the universities that, try to do this, right? Like, I think one of the worst things we can do is to politicize this the same way we politicize cities. Like, look, like, let's look at this as basically an A/B test, right? Like, let's see what the best way is to approach universities. Like, if a university can find a way to operate with some level of classroom instruction without having spikes in cases, we should be applauding that. We shouldn't be critical of them. We shouldn't call out these administrators as being insensitive. I think we should look at them. And yes, if cases spike 100%, we should pressure them, close it down, shut up shop. It's worth a shot. Didn't work out. We're all locked down now. But if someone is able to basically find an innovative approach to that, we can learn from that and maybe even bring it to other campuses. So that's kind of my point about embrace innovation. So I'm now going to backtrack to one of the other points I have in terms of the advice I have for universities, which is this idea of basically seeking feedback. Sorry, my Siri keeps coming off. Basically seeking feedback from your customers, right? And I think this is why coronavirus is going to be such an eye-opener for a lot of universities. Is the universities have kind of had the best of both worlds for a long time. And what I mean is that they've been able to operate like a business from a financial standpoint in terms of what they can charge, in terms of the way that they interact with the people that are within their systems. But they don't have any of the downsides, which is like they don't have to show tangible outputs like a lot of businesses do. Like if your customers are upset, which a lot of grads are, right? A lot of parents are disgruntled with the system right now. They haven't really been held accountable because it's like, what is your option? There's such a strong narrative that like the 4-year degree is like the path you have to take. So any pushback they get, they can basically ignore. And I think that all changes with COVID. And so what universities need to do is they have to recognize that they're going to be under a lot more scrutiny. You take away that college campus experience, you take away the tailgates, you take away the lecture halls, you take away the clubs and organizations, you take away that beautifully complex experience of growing up, right, surrounded by 40,000 people your age. And you ask what's left, and I think that's going to put them under a microscope. And you're going to rightly have a lot of parents and students basically saying, look, I don't want to pay, $45,000 for Zoom courses. And so that is, I think, a good first step, is recognizing that fact and then acting on it. And in the article, I made a basically corollary to what I've seen done in technology. And so I've worked at 2 big tech firms, and LinkedIn and Intuit. And one thing that they both had in common was that they focused a lot on the customer's needs and making sure that the customer felt heard and adjusting accordingly. And I think colleges and universities should take a page out of big tech's handbook, and basically say, look, we want to actually get feedback. So send out surveys, send out emails to parents and to students and ask them what they thought about the online courses. What could be improved? Could they be shorter? Could there be, more Q&A time? Should they have done breakout sessions within Zoom for more people? Do you need more visuals? Parents, what are your biggest questions and concerns? Are you worried about how they're going to learn now? Are you worried about, the health factors, how we're going to address those on campus? Set up stuff like a monthly all hands, or even weekly, like have an online portal where once a week you put your chancellor on a Zoom call and have them talk to the campus, tell them what you're thinking, how you're analyzing things, where things are being improved, address their questions, and do it in a transparent way. So I think this is a massive bucket that a lot of universities are not tapping into, is that they're basically trying to make this decision in a vacuum and operate under the old model. And just the reality is that's not what the university system is anymore. It's definitely being disrupted. I'll add on one of the last big points here. And it's something that I think, regardless, let's say your campus does completely shut down, right? Let's say you don't allow anyone back. I think this is a tangible thing that you absolutely can and still should be doing as a university. And I think that is leaning into the value props that you can control. Okay, so what do I mean by this concept of leaning into the value props you can control? So I think one of the things I really dove into on my book, Modern College, was trying to understand, what do people see as the purpose of college now? When they enroll in school, what is it that you're expecting to get in return? And I think the reality is that, over time with the college system, this has shifted, right? But I also think that it's a little different from person to person, and there isn't just one key one, right? So when I personally think of what did I want from college, right? There were a couple of things. It was number one, obviously I wanted a great education, and being able to be around some of the not only smartest students in my state and in the country, but also around some of the top professors and subjects who have spent their entire life learning about this. The second was I obviously wanted the experience. I wanted to go, to tailgates. I wanted to, be surrounded by 40,000 people my age, all maturing at the same time. I wanted to drink beer. I wanted to join student orgs. I wanted this full college experience and to learn about myself and grow. And so that's a second big bucket. And I think the last major bucket that was kind of in my head is that I expected college to set me up for professional success when I graduated. I went in and basically had this mindset of look, if I'm going to put in all this time, energy, money, I better be better positioned to land a higher paying job than had I not gone to school. Because if school didn't do that for me, or if it sent me in the opposite direction, it would really make me question why I went there in the first place, right? Those first 2 buckets would have to be so strong. And it's hard too, because I think you can get those first 2 buckets other places. I have friends that didn't go to college and still had a really good social lives. I had friends that didn't go to college that still learned a lot online through free resources on the internet. But I think colleges are uniquely positioned on this third bucket, which is, the ability to actually help give you the skills and connect you to the networks you need to land professional success. And this kind of gets back to my last point, right, of what they can do, is you should absolutely be leaning into this value prop of helping students find professional success. So let's talk about what that means, right? Number one, you absolutely should be reaching out to your networks, right? We're in the middle of a recession right now, and there's so much uncertainty and anxiety among recent grads and college students that they're not going to be able to find internships and jobs. Tap into those networks and connect those students with, alumni that are currently out there and are hiring, or at the very least can give them the advice. That'll go a super long way. Set up things like virtual career fairs, right? Like just because you can't have employers come onto there, there's no reason why you couldn't set something up with them where it's virtual. You basically allow people to sign up for slots. They can meet with different, companies that you have partnerships with, ask questions, try to interview and learn things. You should do that. And I think there's this kind of third bucket, and this is, again, gets into this idea of like kind of thinking outside the box, right? Like I know everyone has, probably thin budgets now and stuff, but if there's a way you can get college counselors to either volunteer, whether it's alumni, like as an alumni, I would be very happy to do this, by the way, just to kind of put it from a personal perspective, but get people to actually do, counseling and advising in the professional space, right? Hire more counselors if you can, set up ongoing career coaching services, make this available to students, because here's what's going to happen, right? As parents are going to be like, okay, I'm not getting the education experience as good as I can. Like, let's be honest, Zoom lecture halls just aren't the same as having a full on campus, seeing the professor, going to their office hours, doing like physical labs, right? So that bucket's already going to be hurt. The experience bucket's obviously hurt if you can't go there. Like you're not going to be doing virtual tailgates. You're not going to be having college sports in person. You're not going to be having clubs and orgs. So that one's gone. But this third bucket, you can still deliver on, and you should absolutely be leaning into it. Do everything you can to basically put that front and center and tell people, look, yes, for the short or foreseeable future, right? We can't deliver on these other two value props, but we were going to give you this third one so much that it'll be worth it, and it'll help bridge the gap to when you can come back and experience those first two. I'll finish by saying this, because I know the video has kind of been going on for a while now, is that I want to end by saying that it's really important that universities like stay nimble, right? And what I mean by this is that like this virus is new. It's unlike anything we've ever seen, right? There's a reason we call it the novel coronavirus. And every single day we learn new information, right? New studies come out, new tests are run, and we need to take this iterative and like nimble mindset to universities, right? So if you're a university that opens up, you have to be willing to accept that there's a chance you have to close it down, and you have to close it down fast. So be ready to go the opposite way if you open. Similarly, like I think it's important to note that like if you're going the opposite direction, I think it's important to realize that like your existing online setup might not be as efficient as you thought it was going to be. And you need to make sure you're getting that feedback and you're adjusting the curriculum to the degree that you can, so that you don't have these disgruntled students having like 4 months of poor learning experience or even a full year, but are actually adjusting on the fly. So I think this is one of our, strengths as a nation, is that we tend to, operate on, we're united, right, on the front, but then we also have state level controls. And I think the same thing can happen with universities, where we can learn from each other and we can take those inputs and we can adjust accordingly. So with all that being said, I'll wrap up by saying, look, it's not going to be an easy semester for colleges. It's not going to be a normal semester. If the universities that think it's going to be a normal semester, they're going to be in for a rude awakening. But I think the colleges that recognize that there are, some ways to take a nuanced approach to this, the ones that embrace innovation, the ones that are clear and transparent with their student bases, I think they'll be rewarded in the long run. And I think there's going to be a model we can adapt that'll get us to the other side of this, where that we're much safer and feel more comfortable bringing our students, all of them, back to campus and having a classroom structure. That's all for today. Thanks everyone for watching the video. If you'd like to hear more content from me or read more content, you can check out my book, Modern College, available on Amazon. You can also follow me on LinkedIn at Alex Velitis, and then also follow me on Twitter, Instagram, whatever, Medium, whatever, you name it. I probably have it. And I put out a lot of content. I'm trying to do more. So thanks again, everyone, and best of luck for this fall semester.